Hey everybody, Chad from Patriot Astro, and today I have what I consider to be an extremely exciting video. I mean, do you see the weather behind me? I don't even care. That's how excited I am about today's topic. Today we're going to talk about planet hunting, or maybe more specifically, planet confirmation. And I'm not talking about planets in our solar system, I'm talking about exoplanets. Before I get into too many details and explanations and methodology, I want to tell you the reason I'm doing this video in the first place. Nick Hardy has put together an amazing Nina plugin that can help you throughout this entire process. As I go through it later on in the video, you'll see the capabilities Nick's put into this plugin, and on the face of it at first glance, it's a really interesting and great use of the plugin architecture. But as you yourself start to dive into confirming exoplanets, you'll quickly see how much time Nick's work is going to save you. So anyway, quick round of applause for Nick here. Before I even go a step further, I also want to be very clear about this one point. I'm not an expert on this topic. I'm just the messenger who's hoping to provide you a little education while helping you dive in yourself in such a way that you have the best chance for success. For me, I mentioned in previous videos how after a number of years of imaging the same targets over and over, the hobby can get a little stale. That's why I previously went over imaging an asteroid. This here is another perfect topic for someone that needs a break from the norm. We'll be getting into the plugin here in a little bit, but I think there's a little education that's needed before we dive into it. If you're already well versed in exoplanets, you can always use the chapter mechanism that YouTube gives us at the bottom of these videos to skip ahead. But you may just want to hang out for a while and see if you pick up anything new before you jump around in the video. All right, so let's back up a little here. What are exoplanets? Well, exoplanets are planets that are orbiting other stars outside of our own solar system. There are also exoplanets that are freely moving around the center of our galaxy as well, but we're not going to talk much about those. As far as detecting exoplanets, there are 5 different methods. Radial velocity is watching for a star to wobble due to gravitational pull of another object. They use Doppler shift to detect this. The transit method is basically looking for shadows. It's where we're looking for a star's light to dim as a planet moves between us and the star. Direct imaging is where we take pictures of a star, but we block the light and glare from that star so we can detect the reflection on the objects around it. This is fairly new and complex and may even require space-based telescopes to have a second orbiting star shade deployed in front of it. Gravitational microlensing is just fun to say and it makes you sound really smart. Or as I say when I'm back home visiting my family up in the Northeast, wicked smart. Astrometry is watching multiple stars to see if one star is moving around in relation to the others. This could point to a planet orbiting the moving star. This is very similar to radial velocity, but it doesn't use Doppler shift for detection. The method we're going to be using with our equipment is the transit method. Remember, the transit method requires the orbiting planet to pass in front of the star as we watch it. To oversimplify this, basically what happens is that a star has a certain brightness when you're looking at it. But as the planet goes in front of that star, it will appear to dim just slightly. Now, if you watch that star long enough, over enough time, you start to see that it has a constant dimming pattern. This represents the planet's orbital period as the planet transits at a regular interval. Now, as you can imagine, this is not going to happen all that often. I mean, it takes 1 year for the Earth to go around the sun. So for a distant observer, they would only be able to witness our particular planet's transit once per year, and only if they had the correct line of sight to actually see us transiting the sun. If they were viewing our solar system from the top down perpendicularly, they would never see any of our solar system planets transit the sun. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, the fundamental process here is to point your telescope at a specific star that has a known transit that's going to occur today. From the transits dataset you find online, you will know the expected start time and end time of the transit and have some information about the expected amount of relative flux change that there may be in the star's brightness. If you gather up enough light frames during the window of time where you're imaging, you can eventually plot a graph that looks like this, that proves the transit occurred and match the timing that was expected based on that particular planet's orbit. And just like that, you helped confirm a planetary object orbiting a distant star. Before we jump into Nick's ExoPlanet plugin for Nina, which is the ultimate purpose of this video, I want to talk about and simplify the entire start to finish process of exoplanet research. I'm gonna break this concept up into 7 phases that I literally just made up. Phase 1 is to select a valid target. This is traditionally done through various online databases by using your location and date as filter parameters. There are a couple databases out there which can help you identify what's up in your sky on any given evening as it relates to transits. It's important to understand that just because there is believed to be an exoplanet around a particular star, some targets are better than others for people like you and me. We need to consider the magnitude of the star itself and our ability to see it with our equipment. We also need to consider the relative flux drop that we are expected to see in the brightness, because some objects will be easier to detect while others may be almost impossible with our equipment. Phase 2 is to prepare your imaging system and determine the appropriate exposure length to use for this session. Generally speaking, you want to use an exposure length where your ADU on the histogram is at about 2/3 to 3/4 of the full well depth. I'm not talking about the mean ADU of the entire image. I'm talking about the ADU value of the star. Why is this important? Well, it's important because we need to be able to track the brightness of the star in every frame that we capture. If we oversaturate our pixels, we won't have good data. If we go too low, it may be too difficult to detect the ADU drop of the star when the planet passes in front of it. I'll talk more about this later when we look at the plugin. Phase 3 is imaging and data acquisition. Set up your telescope, polar align, cool the camera, all the normal stuff that you do before you start a sequence. What's a little bit different here as compared to shooting your typical deep space object is that the star will rise and set like any other object, but you don't need to image the star that entire time. You really only care about the exoplanetary transit window. Specifically, you often start imaging a transit 30 to 60 minutes before the transit occurs to get some good baseline info, then through the transit itself, and finally for another 30 or 60 minutes after the transit to prove the transit's completed. Stage 4 is calibration frame acquisition. If you look at most of the documents published regarding imaging exoplanet transits, most of the tools ask you for just 5 flats, darks, and bias frames. The reality is that more calibration frames is okay, but the major point here is that you do need to calibrate your data, so don't forget to take those images. Phase 5 is finding comparison stars. When processing the images in the specialized applications I'll mention later, these apps require comparison stars to be in the image so that they can be monitored as well as the target throughout the imaging process. This is going to help normalize the overall data based on your seeing conditions and other things like that. The comparison star concept is actually a little bit trickier than it sounds. Comparison stars have to be in the same image and should be very close to the same color as the target star. You also don't want the comparison stars to have transits of their own or be variable stars that have fluctuating light levels. Phase 6 is data processing via specialized software packages. 2 examples are HOPS and Exotic. As it happens, both of these software options can be installed on various operating systems as they run using Python code bases with a number of package dependencies. These applications will take in your data and your calibration frames, as well as a great deal of other data points you need to provide, and will process it all the way through until a resulting chart like this can be provided. And finally, we have phase 7. This is sharing the resulting data back to the scientific community. These types of projects where the professional community is reaching out to amateurs like you and me is often called citizen science, where we are the citizen scientists. I'm not a huge fan of the name myself. It sort of feels like a child with a plastic badge labeled junior policeman, but whatever, they didn't ask me for recommendations, so that's what we're stuck with. There are a number of websites that collect this type of feedback, and I'm going to reference everything I talk about here as well as a number of other websites in the description of this video. There are a lot of professionals in this space doing what we are about to do with much larger scopes than yours or mine, some of which are in orbit or are about to be put in orbit. But that professional community is leaning heavily on the amateur community like us to help them in a number of ways. They're wanting people like you or me to use our telescopes to help confirm other data they've already collected so that they can ultimately focus their time on only the best confirmed targets. All right, let's jump into Nina so we can take a look at the plugin and everything the plugin provides us. Here we are in Nina 1.11 nightly as expected. I'm going to take the 7 phases of exoplanet research and put it back on screen here for a second. We're going to refer back to this as we look at the plugin to show you just how much Nick's ExoPlanet plugin helps you throughout this entire process. Let's jump right into the plugin itself. You can see in the plugin list, we have our ExoPlanets plugin. There's a little bit of information about the instructions that Nick has added as part of the plugin. There's also an advanced sequencer template to get you started. We'll cover that later. There's some links about where you can get more information about the data sets and exoplanets in general. There's also a link here for donation, and I don't talk about this all the time, but there's a lot of development hours being put into Nina and the plugins, and a number of other software packages as well that you use. And if you do find there's value, I do suggest making a small donation if that's possible for you to do. Now, there is one configurable option at the bottom of the plugin page, and that is to select the target list that we want to pull from. There are currently 3 options as of the publishing of this video. I recommend you use the TESS Objects of Interest database, only because it tends to have brighter objects that'll be a little bit easier for you in your research as you get started. So after selecting that, we're going to jump right into the advanced sequencer. Now in the advanced sequencer, the first thing you'll see is there's a new instruction set type in the upper right-hand corner. That instruction set is an ExoPlanet object container. Now, as I drag that over here, you'll see after I place the typical deep space object sequence below it, that it's very similar to what we already had. But there are some fundamental differences, and we're going to look at those briefly here. The first thing you'll notice at the top left-hand corner is that there is a select target option. Initially, the list is empty. That's because you need to refresh this list every time you want to use this container. To refresh the list, click the icon on the left-hand side. It's going to take a few seconds. I've sped this up here, but it's going to reach out to that configured data set, in this case TESS, and it's going to retrieve the information for your location for the current window of time you're operating in. Notice that we have a filter available to us if you know what you're looking for. I'll just type 400 here to show you that the filter filters that drop-down list real time. So let's clear that out and then grab one of these options. After selecting a target, off to the right, we have our traditional altitude chart. The typical arc that's plotted here represents the target that we're tracking, which is a star. Now, what we really care about is the planet orbiting the star. Well, the planet will not always be in front of your star, so we need to know when that's going to occur. That's represented here by this plot. Now, this plot will change depending on the object you select. You'll notice that it'll get wider in some cases because the transit of the planet across the star's face is longer. You'll also notice in some cases this transit plot will be taller because the amount of relative flux, or the amount of light blocked by the planet as it passes in front of the star, may be greater, say for a larger planet. Going back off to the left side of the data that's retrieved, we have the name as well as the magnitude of the star and even some notes if it's available to us. Below that, we have the typical coordinate information, the RA index and rotation. Typically, rotation won't be important for tracking this information across the face of a star. Back again off to the right-hand side in the altitude chart, I've highlighted the altitude plot line of the star itself. That is the object we're pointing our telescope at. While we're pointing our telescope at that object, we really only care, though, about the plot line of the transit itself, because that's the window of time of interest for what we're trying to accomplish. So what does this transit plot really represent on our altitude chart? Its representation is very similar to the output you're going to create at the end of your entire data collection and processing. As you can see here at the bottom, we have a relative flux chart that we have in place. Now, this relative flux chart, you'll notice on the left and right-hand side, those plots are right about 1.0 on the relative flux. As we start our imaging, maybe 30 minutes to an hour before the actual transit occurs, that gives us our baseline. What does the star's brightness normally look like when there is no planet in front of it? That becomes 1.0. After the transit completes, we should go back to 1.0 as well, since there's nothing blocking the star once again. However, during the transit itself, when the planet is in front of the star, we would expect some of that light coming to us to be blocked, and therefore the star to dim slightly. That becomes the relative flux. So how much dimmer is it in relation to its norm? For a large planetary body blocking a star, you would expect a larger drop in relative flux. For a planet maybe closer to the star that would block more light, again, a larger relative flux. Larger fluxes are going to be easier for us to detect. Smaller fluxes, say for a smaller planet or a planet with a greater orbital distance from the star, is going to be more difficult for us to detect because the relative flux change will be smaller. So you can see here again in our graphical representation, as I go through a few different targets, some of these planets will have larger relative flux while others will have very small or almost non-existent changes. So let's pick a target and let's talk about why this may be an okay target for us. First, if we look at the star's curved plot line, this star is available for us. It's above my horizon and it's up in the sky at the nighttime. From the data off to the left, I knew it was a 13.2 magnitude star, which should work for me in my scope. Additionally, the depth or change in the relative flux appears to be big enough to be detectable. Also notice that this occurs before the meridian flip. It's ideal to try to avoid the meridian flip, but if the meridian flip does occur, that's okay. Just know that you're going to be missing some data during the flip. Also notice that based on my current time, the now line, I still have time to gather that initial information to give me the baseline I need to understand the current brightness of the star as compared to when the planet transits it and we expect a drop in the light level. So this container itself helps with target selection, and that can be a pretty big challenge. This makes our job a lot easier, not just to understand where we need to target our scope so that we have coordinates for the star, but also we know the window of time where we need to image, and we know what to expect from a flux perspective and transit window perspective. If you were to try to select an object manually, it's a bit more challenging, as you can imagine. So there are some other instructions as well, and the first one we're going to look at is calculate exposure time. So during this process, it's going to be critical that we determine what the right exposure length to use is that's going to set our target star's ADU to about 66% or 2/3 of our full well depth. Now that's hard to do because the histogram that we have on the imaging tab represents the mean for the entire image, not just the target star. We certainly could take a picture and then look at the target star in Nina and then click on the star to get the K value of the star, which is our ADU level. But we have to know exactly what star to click on and make sure we get that piece of information. And then we may have to do it and average it over time. So this plugin locates the right star for us and tells us the appropriate exposure length to do to get the ADU where we need it to be. So here in this particular instruction, you can see I've got my target ADU set to 66%. So let's go back to how this particular instruction works and how it's going to try to find an exposure that gets us to that target ADU of 66% that we've defined. It's initially going to take two images. You can see exposure 1 and exposure 2 are currently set to 30 seconds and 60 seconds. You can adjust those. What the instruction will do when it runs is it'll take the first picture at 30 seconds, locate the star, and identify the ADU level of the star. Then it will take a second image of 60 seconds, locate the star, and determine the ADU level of that star in that image. It will then plot a linear regression based on those two ADU points and those time frames. It'll then attempt to find where on that line 66% of the ADU resides from an exposure length perspective. It will then take a test exposure at that calculated length, locate the star, and see what the ADU is at. If it's within 10% of our 66% range, great. If not, it'll continue to take exposures along that regression line until it finds an exposure length that falls within 10% of our defined criteria for the ADU. Also notice you can set a max exposure length, so you can define the maximum exposure length you're willing to use. You can also define the binning and the gain if you'd like to override your camera settings. Now notice this command doesn't have a filter option. It expects the appropriate filter to already be in place. There are photometric filters that you can purchase. However, you can probably initially get away with a UV-IR cut filter, or maybe even a colored broadband filter you already own. Now once the command completes, the data results will come up on screen as part of the instruction. Notice here the time that was defined was 20 seconds. The maximum brightness of the pixel is listed here. The X and Y coordinate position of the target star is also listed here, as well as how many comparison stars were found throughout this imaging process. If you remember from my earlier discussion, locating comparison stars that work for our target star can be a bit of a challenge. So the thing that's nice about it is it goes a step further than just telling us it found 5 comparison stars. It actually outputs a file to disk for us that is an annotated image. Here's an example of that image. Now notice in red we have our target star. We have X and Y coordinates as well as the maximum pixel value. So it plate solved our image, found the star we should be watching, defined it as the target, gave us coordinates, and then also searched the rest of the image to find comparison stars. Remember, comparison stars have to be of the right magnitude, of the right stellar type, of the right color, and cannot be variable stars. This plugin did all of that work for us. If you didn't have an image from a plugin like this, you would be forced eventually to go into a data set like Simbad on the internet, search for your target star, and then crawl through the images on the right and the data on the left in an attempt to locate non-variable, usable, and similar comparison stars. As you can imagine, this is an enormous time saver. So would you rather have an image like this or crawl through a database? If you're like me, we're all going to be thanking Nick for his hard work on this plugin. So back to our 7 phases, we previously used this plugin to select our target, and now as part of this added command, we have appropriate exposure lengths defined, and we've identified comparison stars. So what else does this plugin have to give us? Well, 2 more commands. The next one we want to talk about is a simple wait command. It's very similar to the wait commands you already have today, and this one will just tell our sequence to wait until we should start our observation. Remember, just because the star is in the sky the whole night for us here, doesn't mean we want to image the whole night. We care about the start time of the transit. Specifically, on the altitude chart, the plot the plugin has given us starts our observation 60 minutes prior so that we can gather that baseline information. So now that we have an instruction that allows us to pause our instruction set until we should start our observations, the next thing we can add is our data collection. How are we going to start capturing images? So what I'm going to do here to be able to gather images in Nina is I'm just going to add a simple sequential instruction set. I'm going to name that picture loop container, and I'm going to drop a smart exposure in here with no dithering. Notice I'm manually defining 20 seconds as the exposure length here because that previous instruction told me 20 seconds was the appropriate exposure length to use to hit my target ADU. It's important to understand that this is a manual process today. Your exposure length based on the output of that previous command. Now I'm going to show you the final instruction as part of the plugin, and it's a loop condition. This loop condition is a loop until transit observation time, and we're going to use end observation. Again, in this case, end observation is pulling from the transit plot up above, and it knows that it's going to allow us to loop until the transit ends. In this case, 60 minutes after the planet completes its movement across the face of the star. So going back to our 7 phases, what can we add to this? Well, imaging and data acquisition. And I can argue that there's a couple others we can add just because of Nina. So preparing our system, as well as gathering calibration frames, meaning our flats, our darks, and our bias. Okay, so from a plugin perspective, we've gone through everything that it has added, except for one other thing Nick's made available to us, and that is his sample sequence. So if I come back to the plugin here, notice there is a template that he provides us, which is a sample advanced sequencer template. So you just need to click on this to download it, come back to the advanced sequencer, and then open it up. Just one final tip here, never save one of these types of targets. It's not like a galaxy or a nebula. You actually need to do a new lookup on the database every time you want to shoot a transit to make sure you have the most up-to-date transit information available. All right, great. Now we have a bunch of images of a star. So what do we do next? Processing. If you remember earlier, I mentioned 2 specific packages that are available, HOPS and Exotic. I'm not going to cover end-to-end processing in this video. There are documents available to help you through the processing. There's also sample data for both of these software packages that you can go ahead and run through the processing engines today. The process is similar in both applications, where you're going to start by selecting your data and calibration frames, identifying your target, and inputting some other information like your location and the time frame. Eventually, if I can get some clear skies, I'll do my own processing video as well, but for now, we're gonna leave it here. If you have any suggestions for other videos, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments or see me over at my website or on Instagram. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And of course, as always, clear skies.